to your doctor and go to Vesicare.com for a free trial offer.
Many times in his political career, people looked upon him perhaps as too friendly, too eager, but that is the way he is. It's a natural interest in other people.
In 1970, George Bush's career path changed following a second unsuccessful Senate race. That's when President Nixon appointed Bush ambassador to the United Nations.
He used to have a practice of just walking down the halls and dropping in on his fellow ambassadors and say, how are things in your country, what's going on?
It allowed Bush to display his style of personal diplomacy. At the height of the Watergate scandal, Ambassador Bush returned to Washington to become chairman of the Republican National Committee. He eventually advised Richard Nixon to resign the presidency for the good of the party.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
Gerald Ford asked Bush what he wanted to do and suggested ambassadorships, and he named specifically the prime plums, London and Paris.
But Bush turned down this token of appreciation.
He really wanted to go to China.
He would ride his bicycle into Tiananmen Square often and visit neighborhoods, and he was just so friendly and outgoing that I think he was kind of a surprising emissary to the Chinese.
Bush was actually creating the groundwork for a future strong U.S. relationship with China.
He loved the job in China, but when they called him back to take over the CIA, which was imploding at that time.
In 1975, the Senate's Church Committee was investigating abuses by CIA operatives abroad.
A lot of people think he was signaling his own political death knell to go to the CIA at such a troubled time. There was a natural fit for George Bush to come in and to say, if there were abuses, we're going to clean it up.
When Jimmy Carter was elected president, that meant Bush would be out as head of the CIA. He would now set his sights on his own run for the White House.
George Bush was nothing but an asterisk in the polls. Nobody thought he had a chance. Everybody said John Connally was central casting's idea of a president.
But Connally fizzled out early. Bush and Reagan were now rivals.
Bush and Reagan slugged it out from state to state. Eventually, of course, Reagan won more primaries, got the nomination.
As the man who finished second, Bush seemed in line for the second slot on the ticket. But it seemed for a time it might not happen.
Everything in the press was saying Ford is going to be the pick. He called me up and said, George, I want you to be my vice president.
I actually answered the phone. And so there was a little tentativeness at the beginning on the part of Governor Reagan.
They were initially very cool and distant and even suspicious of him. The great breakthrough in their view of him, I think, was on the day that President Reagan was shot.
George Bush wouldn't land the helicopter as he was coming back from Texas on the South Lawn of the White House because, as he put it, only the president lands on the South Lawn.
George Bush would not advance himself at the expense of the wounded president.
George Bush was as loyal and as sensitive to President Reagan as he could possibly be.
When George Bush was vice president, he did for President Reagan most of the protocol trips. He would go to funerals. He got to know the world leaders intimately before he became president.
It was at the funeral of Soviet leader Chernenko in 1985 that Bush first met Mikhail Gorbachev.
And I sent the cable saying this man is very different than any of the Soviet that I've known. And it proved to be correct.
When Bush decided to run for president, he used television advertising to sharpen his image.
I was responsible for doing the ads. He had a great sense of humor. He'd say, well, how are you going to help me be president, Ailes? I'm already vice president. And I said, yeah, but you want to be president. You can't do it without me.
Living in Ronald Reagan's shadow for 8 years had its drawbacks.
For somebody like Newsweek to come out and say he was a wimp, it was devastating to him. But he said, you know, the men in the Pacific that I fought with didn't believe that. And I don't think the American people will believe it either.
There are a lot of great stories in politics about the underdog winning, and this is going to be one of them.
At the 1988 Republican National Convention, George Bush did something he was unaccustomed to doing. He talked about himself.
For 7.5 years, I've helped the president conduct the most difficult job on earth.
It was very important that he hit a home run with his speech, and he did hit a home run with it.
But another part of his speech would come back to haunt him in 4 years as a broken campaign promise.
And the Congress will push me, and I'll say to them, read my lips.
The '88 campaign against Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis was a tough battle for Bush.
Mr. Vice President, Jimmy Carter has called this the worst campaign ever.
George Bush supported cutbacks in American education.
His revolving door prison policy gave weekend furloughs to first-degree murderers not eligible for parole. America can't afford that risk.
Distorting my record, full of lies, and he knows it.
Whoever started down this road first of negative campaigning, the American people, from all reports coming to us, are completely fed up.
America can't afford that risk.
In terms of negative campaigning, I don't want to sound like a kid in the schoolyard. He started it.
George Bush would go on to defeat Michael Dukakis in a landslide by about 7 million votes.
The people have spoken.
Still to come, how President Bush used his personal diplomatic experience to deal with old enemies and new threats.